following podcast is for informational purposes only. The contents of this podcast do not constitute tax, legal, or investment advice. Take responsibility for your own decisions, consult with the proper professionals, and do your own research.
Welcome to the GRTiQ podcast. This is part 2 of our 2-part look back on the guests and ideas that shaped the podcast in 2021. During this episode, you'll hear excerpts from episodes 26 through 44. We'll be back with new episodes next week. In the meantime, enjoy listening to part 2 of the very best of 2021.
Episode 26.
From episode 26, a panel discussion with Jim Cousins and Gary Morris, both members of the Graph Council and indexers at the Graph. Here, we talk about the importance of keeping stake decentralized.
I actually made a post, I think it was in February, on this very topic, and there's another one that's just popped up by Oliver from the foundation. So the topic's kind of coming to a head again, and I think anyone listening should go and check that out, and maybe even check out the prior discussions, because we're going through the motions at the moment of determining how we should best decentralize stake, how much we should decentralize that stake. And there's a lot of different and widely varying opinions of how important this is and how this should be done. Personally, I think it's pretty critical to address this early on, in the infancy of a network, because if you let centralization take root, I think it's like a weed. It's going to be so hard to get rid of. So yeah, discussions are ongoing. I'd like to see more engagement from more people, because this affects everyone, no matter their position in the network. Any stakeholder has an interest in this, because it's something so important that will actually keep the network strong in the long run.
Yeah, I would agree, and I would back up those comments with, my own opinion on stake decentralization. Me and Gary, back in the very early days of the forums, that's his post there sort of outlines his feelings and mine as well. This is something that you often get called a doomsayer for mentioning, on any network, but you'll often find it's conveniently swept under the rug. That there's, you'll often see the same players in the top 10 most delegated validators on a network. My biggest concern is that we don't openly address this type of issue prior to the real big participants coming along, by which I basically mean exchanges, right? Because when exchanges come along and they suck up all of that stake that maybe someone else is willing to sell, they put themselves in a position where they make it so easy for their users to just pseudo stake on the network with no bonding or thawing, that it's very difficult to then turn the knobs, I guess, on stake decentralization after the fact. So for me, these conversations that are going on are extremely important. And Gary talked there about wanting to see more people involved in the conversation. And that's really, to me, is paramount, because what I'm most interested in is ideas, right? I'm not really interested in punitive ideas that sort of take from the rich, that type of thing. I'm really not interested in that. But I'm interested to hear about ideas that can capture more of the GRT that's outside of the network right now. Andy from Figment made a good point that, if you look at the numbers, about 30% or just less than 30% of GRT is in the protocol right now. So what can we be doing now in terms of promotions or parameter changes on the network, or some new dynamics for delegation ratios? What can we be doing in that space in order to sort of entice that GRT into the network and also have it disperse among more indexers? So to me, it's all about the conversation and seeing as many people expressing their opinion in that conversation as possible. So anyone looking out for that, Gary mentioned it, a post by Oliver from the foundation around stake centralization. Get in there and get involved.
Episode 27.
From episode 27, Payne with Stake Squid, an indexer at the Graph. Here, Payne talks about how the Graph is different from the other protocols Stake Squid works with.
Oh man, don't get me started. It's everything else is quite literally at this point, given that those networks and protocols are quite old on the market, Stuff like Solana, for example, is literally just you plug a few commands and you press start and it magically works. For the graph, we tried to do something similar by running, by having our Docker Compose stack that I think most of the network uses it right now, but it's a lot more different. I don't know how to explain it. Like the graph has so many moving parts compared to like Solana, for example, right? In the graph stack, you have the graph node, which you can split it into two, the query and the index node. And then you have the index agent, the index service, the database or databases, depending on how much you want to scale or have redundancy and stuff. It's a very complex system compared to Mina, Solana, Avalanche, and that sort of stuff. And this is the reason why I love the graph so much, because it's so different than anything else, and you always have something new to learn. You always find things to do, things to improve, things to work on. I'm not aware if you know, but recently I've been working on the testnet repository. I had an advanced configuration that was using as a separate branch, but now I integrated it into the main branch. And technically speaking, anyone that was running the old version before and upgrades now, it'd be basically seamless upgrade. You don't need to do anything manually. Just make sure that you have the right environment variables, which is fun. And it's a lot more configurable than the normal stack that we were running before, for example. And we're planning to work on that going forward to make it even more robust and even to give people even more choices of configuration.
Episode 28.
From episode 28, Carl Hagerling, co-founder and design lead at Edge and Node. Here, Carl talks about the origins of the Graph brand and logo.
So when joining the Graph, I had the luxury because we had nothing. We had no logo, we had no brand, it was just a name, the Graph. And that is a luxury to be able to shape everything. It's like a white canvas. But that could also be terrifying and limiting. It's like, do whatever you want. Where do you start? You have to anchor yourself somewhere. So that's the first thing I did. Anchor myself. And then together with the other, it was just Janiv and Brandon and Janice at the time, and also Rodrigo was a great mind. So then I formed some keywords. What is it all about? And it could be solid. It could be adventurous, pioneers, soft words like that. But one of the words was infrastructure. And I pivoted towards infrastructure. And I saw it it felt like the Graph has always been around, even if it was new, because it felt so, not monolithic, but solid. And it feels almost like the Matrix, everything around us is the Matrix and you're in it. And I saw the Graph similar. So I went back in time and looked on old civilizations. And because the infrastructure kind of connects them and defines them, like roads, water systems. And that drove me towards the Aztec civilization. And it was something about that, how things looked that just gravitating towards me. It was so much inspiration there. So I created this kind of pattern inspired by the hieroglyphic carvings, architecture, and art that felt just a pattern of communication of small digits floating into a system. And that was kind of the starting point. They also have a god in the Aztec civilization, for symmetry. I don't remember the name for him, but the god of duality. And that two things, it also everything has two sides. And that's also, I really like that visually. But then it was not just about the infrastructure and the duality. It was also about that they had a really strong sense for astronomy and the space and the calendar. So they looked down in the infrastructure, but they also looked up in space, out in the stars. And that kind of dynamic, like space and old. So space is like the future, forward. And then you have the infrastructure. That's kind of the past. So the old meets the new. So it feels like it's always been around, but it's facing the future. So if you look at the colors, come the purple, blue that comes from space, and you have the iconography that comes more from the Aztec hieroglyphics. And if you look at the logo, it's actually like a planet with a spaceship and a moon orbiting around. So that is the story with the brand of the graph, more or less.
Episode 29.
From episode 29, Curation Station with Data Nexus and GraphGod. Here, Data Nexus and GraphGod share their long-term vision for the graph.
Yeah, so the graph is solving a data problem that exists in Web3. And Chris Wessel has mentioned on one of the earlier GRTiQ podcast episodes how, once layer 2 is being incorporated, as well as Ethereum 2 and all the different changes to that block, to how the blockchain will look there, as well as all of the other blockchains. These are all different data sets that are storing information in ways that are not intended to be queried rapidly, or they're not built to be queried rapidly. And so, my long-term vision is that we're providing really the resource for looking at any historical data on the blockchain and obtaining it quickly in a way where the user doesn't even think twice about it, because there's, it's being presented so quickly. So I see it as being, kind of a core piece of really any DApp that has a need for historical information, which is essentially everyone. Everyone needs data, and that's what we provide. And that's why the graph is just in an incredibly great position for Web3.
I've mentioned earlier in the podcast about how I see basically the web moving over to the blockchain, with tools like IPFS and all that. And, like Derek said, without a doubt, we have a data problem. And one of the greatest ways that I've heard the graph described was in a tweet by Ava Balin. She said that the graph is a decentralized data market. And that's just it. Like Derek said, there's a ton of information that's going to be needed. Just to put it into context, I believe that the Sushi Swap analytics page makes something like 70 requests to the graph on one page just to provide all the information that's needed on that one page. So clearly there is a need for an enormous amount of data and to be able to access that information quickly. That's only one example. And of course, DeFi is fairly complicated, but there's plenty of other applications which typically require access to terabytes worth of data quickly. I mean, if you think about something like Facebook or Twitter, how much information they likely process every fraction of a second is probably, is more than you could read manually in maybe your entire lifetime. So, we have this problem, and Graph is the solution. Not only is it the solution, it's the first solution. And so it has an excellent position going forward, being the first mover, and having that advantage. So, the vision is every site, every service that needs information is eventually going to use the graph for it.
Episode 30.
From episode 30, Brendan Asselstein, co-founder and chief technology officer at Pool Together. Here, Brendan discusses when he first became aware of the graph.
Yes, this was some time ago. Well, it was over a number of hackathons, because the graph was present at a number of hackathons, namely ETH Denver hackathon, and the ETH New York hackathon. I met Yaniv at both those events. And so I knew about their tech, and we tried it fairly early on for some of Delta Camp's projects and found that it was just such a suitable use for the event sourcing technology, which is basically like replaying a bunch of different events to kind of hydrate your kind of current state of the system. And the graph allows you to do this. And it was so exciting to be able to play with this tech. It's something I've been looking at for a long time. It's really cool tech. It's kind of like how it's how Uber does their real-time analysis on their like ride data coming in. It's really industrial grade stuff. And so it was really neat to be able to play with this with respect to the blockchain. It was such a perfect application. So we were using the graph for a long time, the graph on the hosted service anyway, for a long time. And yeah, we're including it with all the different projects. I mean, it was good for a couple different reasons too. Not only was it an applicable use of that technology, but their long-term vision was very much aligned with the ideology, the ethos of the space, which is self-sovereignty, which is censorship resistance, which is sort of power in numbers and ownership by many people. And so, yeah, I knew it was the right technology to use. And so we've been with the graph for its transition from the hosted service now through to the decentralized network. And I'm really impressed with how well they've done, how well they've managed that transition, because with a piece of technology as complex as what they've been building, it's not easy. But they've managed to do it in a fairly slick way, and the new studio is just fantastic to work with.
Episode 31.
From episode 31, Alex Falco with Citadel One, an indexer at the graph. Here, Alex answers the question of how the graph is different from other protocols Citadel works with.
If you are working with like a lot of networks, you can classify crypto space. At least that's what we are trying to do inside our team. And if you will ask me, I believe we have layer one protocols, which is like Bitcoin or Ethereum or basically Cardano, Solana, just any layer one solution, which allows a lot of like depth to be built on top of that. Then we have some kind of layer zero solution, which are Cosmos and Polkadot for sure. And then we have a middle layer. So Graph, it's like the example of a middle layer protocol solution. It's a kind of a protocol which like connects everything and provides data like for all those other layers. And again, like in physics, we have like gluons. It's like a subatomic particles which glue all the stuff together. And like the best possible comparison I can provide, it's like the graph is what is gluons for subatomic particles. And of course, it is different from other middle layer solutions such as oracles. Link is the most popular one, then some others. But unlike them, Graph is providing a kind of decentralized APIs. And I believe like it's quite rare how to say network, because if you will ask me, I cannot name you like the second one which do the same stuff which Graph do. And for us, it was like a no-brainer to launch a Graph indexer node, because we are trying to get those which like those solutions which we believe would be like the essential part of the coming Web3 world. So Graph, in my opinion, like is unique and very important in that sense.
Episode 32.
From episode 32, Jarvis Silva, a curator at the Graph. Here, Jarvis talks about when he first became aware of the Graph.
Yeah, I attended a conference, the Smart Conference last year. And in that conference, Yaniv did a presentation, a very nice presentation about the Graph. So when he started to talk about indexing and organized data, blockchain data, that phrase called my attention, because I knew that it was a very important layer, that it's very cost intensive in time, and we need a lot of resources to do that. So I see that the Graph had a huge potential to transform the industry. So at that time, I started to study about the Graph. I jumped in the Discord to get to know what was the stage of the project, what that community is all about. So I started to dig deeper in order to understand the protocol. It was very difficult in the beginning because actually the protocol is very complex, but we also have a very, very vibrant community, a community willing to answer questions and to explain all the features of the protocol. So it was my first step in the protocol, and at that time I'm trying to understand about the indexer role, but the mission control was already in place. So I lost the deadline related to the indexer program, but I stay in touch with the community all the time in order to looking for new opportunities.
The GRTiQ podcast is made possible by a generous grant from the Graph Foundation. The Graph Grants program provides support for protocol infrastructure, tooling, dApps, subgraphs, and community building efforts. Learn more at thegraph.foundation. That's thegraph.foundation.
Hi, this is GRTiQ. If you've been paying attention, then you know that 2021 was a breakout year for the graph. And 2022 promises to be another important year, and GRTiQ podcast will be here for all of it. In fact, we have a few surprises we're going to make available to you in the new year, including updating our website with some great new features and content, broadening our focus to include more of what's happening in Web3, and releasing a monthly newsletter that will provide listeners with a unique news story. The story of how Web3 is coming to life as told through the cutting-edge data and analytics made available only through the Graph protocol. A lot's going to happen in the new year, and we'll be here to shine a light on those helping to make it happen, to tell their stories, and to share their insights. Thanks for listening to this podcast.
Episode 33.
From episode 33, Richie LeBurn and Boyd Vardy with Index Africa, an indexer at the Graph. Here, Boyd and Richie talk about how the Graph creates value for Index Africa and decentralized philanthropy.
Well, again, speaking as a layman, we set up our indexing node and we started to see how, as a result of us running that indexing node, literally we started to generate token value. And that was the beginning of it. We started to see how instead of extracting value out of the network, this network was in fact displacing value into it, which was profound. At the same time, separate to indexing, we had been involved in setting up this foundation, the Good Work Foundation. We had 6 learning centers operating in the most rural parts of South Africa. And from a philanthropy point of view, we had to go out every year and try and raise $2 million to maintain the running of those learning centers. And in fact, across in the philanthropy space, the holy grail of philanthropy that's been around for the last while is for people to be able to develop some kind of sustainability built into the philanthropic endeavor. Everyone in the philanthropy space has been trying to get away from the old models of just endless donations and say, how do we actually make this sustainable? And as the node started generating rewards, we immediately saw the possibility of starting to tie the node together with the education system in the development of a model that was founded in abundance. And so the idea is that, delegators stake onto our node indexes data and produces rewards. A percentage of those rewards flow into our digital learning centers where young, talented African people are upskilled in digital education, preparing them for the future Web3 economy. In turn, with those skills, they come into the Web3 space and start developing the economy itself. They start to provide development skills into that space. The delegator, instead of making a donation, is able to, because they delegated, they're able to earn on their money and return their stake to themselves. And so everywhere you looked inside of the model, there was just incredible abundance for everyone. And that model didn't just come to us, it slowly started to emerge. And that's what we've been building up to this point. And already this year, we've put 80 kids from the most rural backgrounds into a digital education process that will start to prepare them to participate in this future economy. And we're in our absolute infancy. And the possibility, I honestly believe that, this DeFi space, digital philanthropy, it will become the future of philanthropy. The model is so incredibly powerful and it offers wins for everyone through the chain. And so again, like Index Africa is the coming together of a number of unexpected things. And all of this is what I should really say too, is that all of this is made possible by the presence of, the Graph protocol. And what I'm so excited about is when we set out to index, when we first started learning about the Graph, we could never have imagined that this is what emerged out of it. I'm sure that the founders of the Graph protocol had no idea that someone would be doing this inside of their network. And I think it goes to show that if you create these systems, you create these networks, you actually don't know how people will innovate on them, but you can be sure that the network will drive innovation. And, that's certainly where we found ourselves in a highly unexpected innovation that driven by the Graph protocol that could, and I am certain will be the future of philanthropy. I mean, we're only a few months in and we are changing rural African people's lives and preparing them to be competitive in a future marketplace. And there's a leapfrog opportunity there. There's latent talent in Africa that is going to be unlocked by this. And the more delegation that we can attract through being a world-class indexer, the more lives we can affect on the ground. I think what makes us unique is that we are on-the-ground African operators who are also connected to this global economy through the Graph. And so we just have tremendous scope to play here. And I want to see this rolling out all over Africa. And I want to see high-level developers funded by the network coming out of our learning center and building incredible DApps onto the network in the future and advancing the space of Web3. So couldn't be more excited about this.
So, yeah, just building on it, I want to naturally just try and simplify it. This whole DeFi model, the decentralized philanthropy, is really like in the same way that DeFi, decentralized finance, has reinvented finance. Essentially what we're trying to do is take delegation, putting it into an escrow by delegating it onto a node, earning rewards, return an APY for the delegator, and allowing them also to benefit from the growth and the price of the Graph token. And a portion of our rewards are then used to fund these learning centers and to fund projects that help with the development of digital education and Web3 education. But I think most importantly is that as more people start to participate, there's a self-reinforcement that happens on the Graph network that provides, that sort of underpins the premise of decentralization. As in the more people that you have using a network, the stronger it becomes. And that's what's also tremendously exciting about the concept of DeFi.
Episode 34.
From episode 34, TM Lee, co-founder and CEO at CoinGecko, on how CoinGecko uses the Graph.
Yeah, so like back in 2019, I suppose we get a lot of requests that they want to see Uniswap data on CoinGecko, and as mentioned at the time, figuring out how to index all the Uniswap data properly and at scale wasn't something that we are focused on. Like we built all the modules and everything to index centralized exchange, but DeFi was relatively new at the time. So there were a couple of solutions shared to us, and then one of them was the Graph. So had some time to take a look at what the Graph really is, how it works. And it was, the interface is nice, the playground is easy to use. So we just started off by integrating Uniswap data. So we got like Uniswap V2, eventually the market data, all the tokens that are trading over there coming in. And then later on, new DEX were launched like Balancer, Curve, and then all the copies that came in after that were all plugged into the Graph as well. And it makes it really easy for us to just, get a project to just follow, like, say, a standard, like Uniswap V2's subgraph, and then our integration would just work seamlessly. So almost, like, I would say 80% or so of our DEX integration on CoinGecko is powered by the Graph to some extent.
Episode 35.
From episode 35, Boggy and Chris Ewing from the Graphnauts. Here, Chris shares the history of the Graphnauts.
Sure. Ironically enough, the group was originally founded by an individual who was involved with the token, purchased a bunch, was excited about it, and then sold right before the rally to the all-time high back in February. He left the group, which kind of left a leadership vacuum. R, which many of you are familiar with from the Telegram group, stepped into that position, assumed some of those responsibilities, and the rest of the admin has filtered in behind him, coming at different times. There's a lot of different people that are represented there. We've got a couple people from the UK. We've got a couple people from the United States. Begge is Italian. We've got another guy from Norway. So we've got a pretty good selection of people. Nobody's in one time zone. So we got people spread out around the globe, giving us a pretty good coverage of the Telegram group. There's always somebody online, especially when you get into some of the OG Graphnauts. Our mission and what we're about, we want to create a positive, supportive community for holders who understand the potential of the graph and realize that in order to recognize that potential, you're going to have some patience. This is something that is a long-term bet for those of us that are involved in that. The space evolved from being just a place for holders, but it's evolved into a learning center for delegation and other aspects of the graph that come up just through the course of conversation. I think my personal opinion is that the Graphnauts play a role within the community. We serve a purpose. We love watching people realize the value of what they're holding. That's one of the most exciting things to me, is to have a conversation with somebody and they're uncertain as to who they want to delegate to, or what the potential of the graph is. And when you explain to them and when they understand the underlying value of what they're holding, it's exciting to watch that light bulb come on, and see people with that aha moment, and they're like, okay, now I get it. And delegate, hold, and become a member of the community and help encourage other people as the conversations permit.
Episode 36 and 37.
Episodes 36 and 37, a two-part series with Brandon Ramirez, co-founder and research and product lead at EdgeNode, and one of the original founders behind the graph. Here, Brandon talks about the origins of the graph.
So Yaniv had the original idea for the graph. So some stuff that was, I think, relevant at that time is GraphQL was really changing the way that applications got built, in traditional web apps, in ways that if you're kind of outside the space are sort of subtle and maybe underappreciated. But GraphQL, among other things, gave companies and enterprises a way to, behind a single API, represent all the data in their organization and have it be queried in a way that was efficient and flexible, which was a large departure from the way that enterprises used to be managed, where you would have these various REST API endpoints that were sort of rigid. They only returned like a certain set of data. They weren't collected behind a single endpoint. There would be like disparate microservices in the background, each with their own endpoints often, and made it really hard to think about what was the universe of data that existed behind some application or enterprise or organization. And once you start working with GraphQL and you start seeing how easy it is to express this kind of large interconnected data domain, the sort of obvious thing that comes as the next step is really, if you think about the data in the larger internet, it also has this conceptual interconnectedness, right? That's not the way that we architect things because of the sort of legacy primacy of the SQL database and the API servers that we used to build around them. But a user in GitHub is not different than a user in Twitter or a user in Facebook. They're essentially, conceptually, you can think of them as a single entity. An account, for example, in one application might have relationships to a user's activities in some other application, right? So the way that, traditionally the web has been architected, because we didn't have the infrastructure that would allow you to use data itself as an interoperability layer, is that we would create these silos, right? So you would have to have your SQL database, which is very dangerous to let anyone access directly. Then you build these API servers around them that have things like access control, and they sort of map these REST endpoints to, the sort of schema of the database. And then when you want to do this kind of connectivity and integration of data, you have to do it at the API layer. So you've had entire cottage industries like Zapier, Unito, emerge that are basically bubblegumming and paper clipping these sort of like closed APIs to one another. And when you integrate things in that fashion, you're not really using the data itself as the interoperability layer. You're really just creating these copies, right? You're passing data back and forth to try and synchronize the data between, a user in GitHub's database versus a user in Facebook's database or a user in Twitter's database. But they're fundamentally copies that are not synchronizable at a fundamental level. So that's kind of one larger trend that was happening, was just rethinking the way that we represent data. Actually, for listeners that are interested, I wrote a blog post really early on this called GraphQL Will Power the Decentralized Web, where I kind of go through in like more detail, like a lot of the things that make GraphQL uniquely qualified to sort of be the API endpoint for decentralized apps. The other thing that was kind of happening was, Yaniv and I had this experience, with this first startup. I didn't mention this, but like one of the big pain points that we were trying to address for restaurants at that time was negative feedback on Yelp or inaccurate data on Yelp or other, kind of review platforms. And so there was this kind of, there was this question of like, what is the sort of verifiable public data with respect to some entity, right? Like a restaurant or some other business or a place or a location, right? We didn't have the systems and the tools in place then to kind of agree on what the true state of these public data sets were. And so I know that's something that Yaniv was thinking a lot about, sort of at the inception of the graph is, wasn't just like, how do we make data publicly available, but like, how do we decide, what data is actually true and deserves to be part of this large global graph? That's an area where I think that latter part is an area where I think the crypto space as a whole still has a lot of work to do. I know there have been some projects kind of geared towards deciding what is true, whether it's prediction markets, whether it's using oracles, whether it's trying to create, reputation systems with domain experts. Today, the graph primarily addresses the issue of indexing and querying that public data. But once those protocols become more developed, you can imagine the graph actually being a global open API of true data, right? It could represent some kind of global consensus on the data that's being queried. Now it doesn't have to, right? But those are the tools that are available to anyone building on the graph and building on these emerging crypto protocols. So that was kind of where the initial vision started, was this idea of a global graph of verifiable public data. And I think Yaniv had the first spark of this probably in like the summer of 2017. He was also, reading a lot of white papers around decentralized databases at the time, and also trying to think through, okay, what would the application stack look like for fully decentralized applications? The thing that we were missing was kind of a strategy, right? So like a vision is kind of where you want to end up, and a strategy is sort of like the route you take to get there. And I kind of mentioned this earlier in the interview, some of the lessons we learned in the first startup around kind of what are the sequence of things that you need to verify to get from A to Z. And it wasn't until we pivoted our team into consulting in the blockchain space that we started experiencing some of the problems that decentralized application developers would go on to experience. So just how difficult it was to index data from the blockchain for a whole bunch of technical reasons that we can get into, and put them in a database where they can be queried easily to drive some kind of application. That was a problem that we were witnessing our clients spend tens, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars to try and address. And so that was some like really early validation that, hey, there might be a problem here that's worth solving. And it's through finding that, like, we obviously could have solved that in many ways, right? We could have started a SaaS company, right? That would have been a completely viable business model once you identify a problem that users are willing to spend tens of thousands of dollars on. And that's where the vision comes in, right? Our vision was that we wanted to create this global graph of, verifiable public data. We want to bring to life the promise of the decentralized web. And those things would only be possible if we sought to solve that problem as a protocol. So in about December and like January, February of 2017/2018, we started working on a demo. So Yaniv and Yana started hacking on like a demo app built in Go, and I started doing the research for how this would work in a decentralized context as a protocol. And I wrote the white paper, and that was kind of first thing that we showed the early supporters of the graph when we were looking for financial backing to work on this problem.
Episode 38.
From episode 38, Quan Huang, founder at Scout and Wave 2 grant recipient, sharing his ideas for how the graph is the database for Web3.
Yeah, I think, first of all, the blockchain itself is a very simple version of database and a computer. Now, the whole world is using it. But to actually scale it, you need to organize in a much more efficient way. We need something more than just a blockchain, like the Ethereum blockchain itself. So the graph basically, I think the indexing layer is a key part of database. You just need so many of them to solve different specific problem. When we building a traditional application using database, we're just building so many index. There's one giant index to solve a few common problem. Maybe 30% of problem will be solved by this one index. Then there's so many niche problems. You need a very specialized index to do that. And also, in addition to index, you also need to be able to package data in different way. Just using one simple example, let's say you want to show all the trade happening on Uniswap, but you want to display data not in the token number, but in US dollar volume. So you can basically pull data from the blockchain, and then you can pull data from some exchange rate and then mix them together and then display it. Or you can pre-package them. Every time there's a trade happening on blockchain, on the Ethereum blockchain, you calculate them and calculate the US dollar amount and then save that into the database, the graph, which is easy to query, which is fast and more efficient. So that's just one simple example. And I think we are seeing use cases like this happening every day. And so you just need an intermediate layer to sort of massage these raw blockchain data. And that's what I call it database. Although I think the graph still call it the API of Web3. In my view, I don't think it's accurate. I think the graph is also doing a lot of things more than just API.
Episode 39.
From episode 39, Nena Jaja, product engineering lead at Edge and Node, on Web3 and the potential impact on the world.
Yeah, this is a very kind of a broad question. This is a question that can have very broad answers to it, depending on what you specifically focus on. So to me, in terms of the whole idea of the web is peer-to-peer, being connected to your peers, having access to information easily, sharing things with other people easily, etc., etc. And then what Web 2 became in the last years, I'd say, is it became something like a data economy, where even though through social networks and other, publishing media, people got a lot of power in terms of you can create your content, you can get it out there, you can get paid for it. So a lot of people became creators of content versus in Web 1 where there's not that many. However, the data of these people is owned by big companies, Google, Facebook, Amazon, etc. And what they're doing is selling the data and making money off of it. And of course, when you join these tools, you sign whatever terms of service, and nobody reads the super small print, but you actually sign that it's okay to sell your data. And there's no other way. Otherwise, you wouldn't be able to use these platforms. So this now turns into this big centralized world where like just a few companies own the data, sell it, do whatever they want to do. And another concern there is there's so many data breaches. Just the other day, I put my email address and I noticed that my data was hacked. Email, password, address, everything in so many places, thousands of times. Crazy. because those central servers are so prone, and hackers are, pretty much now, thousands of hackers are trying to hack into their data centers. And that's the vulnerability of Web 2. And so in this specific area, what we are trying to achieve with Web 3 is decentralize where the data is being stored. So many people around the world can have nodes and have own chunks of data. So there's no more incentive for them to sell their data because they don't have all the data. Big things have been done in terms of cryptography and security of their data. And now people can participate in Web3. There's another incentive to participate in Web3 by having these tokens. And there's many ways to earn tokens. But now the earning tokens and participating in Web3 becomes way more direct. I can send you tokens. I can interact with you. I don't need to go through a third-party PayPal, etc. service who's going to gather my data and do whatever they want with me. I can just interact with you. To me, this is huge. There is more ways for people to get involved in building the web. There's less centralized points of failure. I know a lot of people talk about it. But to me also, it created a lot of job opportunities across countries and continents. There's a whole other aspect, and I think this more affects the finance of people living. And I've read a lot about this, for example, in countries in Africa. Just sending money to somebody includes gigantic amount of fees. Their currencies are unstable. There's huge inflation. So they're starting to use crypto as a way of sending money directly to another person versus going through layers of fees through whatever institutions are and things like that. I can't talk much about finance. I'm just reading about it. It's not my expertise. And then, of course, there's NFTs that are coming up now that we're still trying to figure out, what's the use and benefit of it? Does it have to do with ownership of your own art there? What does it exactly have to do with? And a lot of people have a lot to say for that. But that could be an interesting application how Web3 plays along. And also to mention now, I think Web3 is expanding into music and video and gaming. And also people can run their own nodes and earn tokens that way. So I just think it's like the catchphrase would be kind of giving more power to people and decentralizing power. And I think that's happening in many ways. And we are still early enough, but not too early. Now, I think the majority of people can start to see, this is a real thing. And we are kind of crossing the chasm. That's how I feel, into like a bigger, more of a mass adoption. So I feel it's just super exciting. And I know I use the word exciting in terms of crypto so many times, but it is to be a part of this.
Episode 40.
From episode 40, Eugene Asiv, founder and CTO at Chainstack. Here, Eugene talks about when he first became aware of the graph.
I think I learned about the graph around spring 2020. I think that was around the time the project was being open to public, and that was the time when the mission control testnet was about to launch. And at that point of time, it was clear that it's a very interesting project, but it was not obvious as today that it will become the core pillar of the Web3 infrastructure, at least to me. Of course, it was obvious to the team, I think, and to the more thoughtful people in the community at that point. For me, it was obvious that it's a very interesting project, and I would like to follow it, and I would like to participate in it. And we were sort of forced to participate in it when the mission control launched, because people were looking for archive Ethereum nodes everywhere. And we were one of the providers that were doing well here, and we were providing shared nodes, dedicated nodes. So if you want to run a small indexer operation, if you want to run a large indexer operation, we provided you these options. And also the platform was absolutely self-service, so anybody could come and deploy their own dedicated node. At that point of time, it was probably 4 terabytes of disk immediately, and it was available to you in like 10 minutes, and it was up to date. It was in sync with the chain, so it was pretty useful for the early indexer community. And we've basically seen an influx of new customers for this particular service around August 2020. And since then, it was kind of clear that we are essential part of this infrastructure stack, because you still need to have a node to run the graph APIs, because all this data needs to be indexed, and currently all the data is stored on chain and it's being served by the node. So since then, we've been following the graph very closely. We've been working with the graph very closely, and we're doing this until now as well.
Hey, this is Stefan from the Graph Academy, announcing the Graph Academy Grants Program, a program that is intended to foster the growth of our community-driven platform, the Graph Academy. We are offering grants to contributors to incentivize the creation of high-quality educational material. If you want to apply, simply visit thegraph.academy/grants, that is, thegraph.academy/grants. You can also find more information in the show notes.
Episode 41.
From episode 41, Hiroki Katabi, research analyst at The Block. Here, Hiroki shares his ideas between the difference between Web 3 and Web 2.
Yeah, so the deeper I dug into it, the more I realized that the biggest difference is about how data structures are stored and organized in Web 3 versus Web 2. So I think that, the answer would be about, if you want to understand Web 3, you really have to understand the backbone data structure of Web 3. And then what's amazing about Web 3, I guess, is that once you see that really the fundamental thing is about these data structures, essentially about distributed servers, nodes, blockchain, versus centralized servers that we have in Web 2, like AWS, just by sort of changing the way that data is stored, secured, and so forth, as well as giving these data structures state. In other words, retaining a sort of history of the entire ledger and so forth, and controlling state history transitions and so forth. These things give rise to a lot of the high-level topics that people are talking about. It's just that those sort of connections, I think, haven't been made that clearly. So people talk about decentralization, they talk about ownership, or things like verifiability when it comes to Web3. And all of these come from the basic data structures that Web3 is built on. And so that became really fascinating. And I'm on a journey now in the process, publishing articles and doing more and more research to basically keep seeing how this backend to front end link works. And when I say backend, I mean, like, let's say, for example, blockchain, all the way up to front-end applications like wallets and gateways, but how those experiences, or video games, applications, NFTs in there, how that's going to give rise to really social level changes in terms of user experience with decentralized organizations, ownership of parts of the web, public and community ownership, verifiability of the sort of public data that has reached consensus in a fault-tolerant way, and execution, which is about sort of how smart contracts work, which is that they execute exactly as they're written. And so if you pick up on sort of the keywords that I use, they are DOVE. So this is my fun acronym, which I think is sort of a nice symbol for Web3, which is DOVE, the sort of symbol of, liberty and freedom and hope.
Episode 42.
From episode 42, Alex Bourget, co-founder and CTO at Streaming Fast. Here, Alex explains Streaming Fast Firehose technology.
Well, you said it right. I mean, it's more easily indexed, and it's more easily transferred, it's more easily verified. So, at the risk of being a little technical, right? When you have a blockchain node, it's a running program on a computer somewhere, and it has a database underneath. And what people do today is they connect through the network and they query that running program so that this running program reads in its database and outputs some data. Our model was to say, this is slow. This requires a lot of memory, a lot of CPU, a lot of SSD disks that are fast, resources, computing resources that are costly. So we said, let's be done with that because people are interested in the data. Let's separate the data from the computing needs. And so we extract it. We run the blockchain node, but the first thing we do is we output the data and put it in a file. So that's much easier to transform. Reading a file is much easier than querying a network system because it can fail. The disk density is much less costlier also. Loading a file, the files have been optimized like crazy. Like think S3, think, the Google bucket stuff, storage there, Azure. These guys have made the cost of these things so low. A hard drive, like the cost shrinks each month. Putting that on a file flat, and there's also different grades of there's fast disks, but maybe if you don't use the data a lot, put it on a slow disk, something that is even cheaper. Like that's been optimized like crazy. And to tell you the truth, that's what's used in the data science world, like more and more. That's actually fascinating because you have these big engines like they do at Google. What people do to feed data in those big data systems, like a BigQuery or something like that, they actually write files in the storage, and that's the source where a big query is going to load and process the data files. So yeah, that was the premise. And the fire hose is a little bit of two things because it takes the node and in real time, it spews out the data. So there's an aspect of it which is a stream of live data. And the fire hose sort of bridges the real-time stream and the fallback on the files so that you don't see anything. Like you're going to go really, really fast reading the whole history because it's reading from flat files. And at some point, poof, it flips and goes in real-time mode. And all of a sudden, you're on the edge. And what I was going to say earlier is you're on the edge and you're on the fastest edge there is because of the nature of the push streaming, right? Let's imagine you have 3 blockchain nodes and they are, in sync in different places of the world. Maybe the first guy in Taiwan sees the block and outputs and then pushes it to the client. Well, you'll have the first of the 3, one in Taiwan, one in Frankfurt, and one in Montreal. The first one to see it is going to push it to you. So you're going to have the fastest, right? Everyone is racing to push you data as fast as possible. So that by design made it like an awesome streaming solution, the fastest there could be by design. So yeah, I find it fascinating. I love it because I see nowhere where something could arrive and outcompete the fire hose. Fastest, most parallelizable, the most complete data-wise. So there's no room for, beating it in a way. So that's why I'm happy that it lands in the graph so we can reach the whole world and make it the de facto solution for, reading any blockchain data. I think it's a pattern that will apply to all blockchains.
Episode 43.
From episode 43, Sam Green, co-founder and CTO at Semiotic AI. Here, Sam talks about the cryptography capabilities the Semiotic will bring to the graph.
Well, before I say anything about our cryptography efforts, I'd like to give recognition to Jackson Blazinski at EdgeNode. He has been mapping out the direction that we are now pursuing for several years, and he has, really laid the groundwork for our team to come in and start working with him. I believe that this topic of cryptography, the story deserves further expansion, and I think Jackson himself would be a great person to tell that story on the GRTiQ podcast. But in terms of what we're doing at Semiotic, specifically, we're working on zero-knowledge proofs. I'd like to give some intuition about the types of problems or the type of problem that ZKP can solve. So at a high level, ZKP lets us do 2 things. It lets us prove that somebody else knows something that they say they know, or that somebody else has done some work that they claim that they have done. Well, why is that important in the context of the graph or Ethereum? Well, I'll start with a more general use of ZKP, and then I'll tie it to Ethereum, and then we'll tie it to the graph. Imagine you had some tiny computer, some very small, low-power device, and you wanted it to do some sort of heavy-duty computation. but your device just didn't have the horsepower to do it. Well, with zero-knowledge proofs, you can outsource this heavy-duty computation to a machine that has more resources than you have, like a heavy-duty machine. And the heavy-duty machine can take your inputs that you want processed, and it will send you a result. You could do that today, right, without any cryptographic technique like ZKP. But if you don't have ZKP, then for most applications, you won't really know whether or not the outsourced computation was done how you needed it done. They could have skipped steps, or they could have manipulated the result. ZKP solves this problem. So the awesome aspect of ZKP is that when you outsource a computation to the more powerful node, more powerful computer, in addition to it doing the computation that you've asked it to do, it will also generate a proof. And it will return both the result of the computation to you and a proof of the computation, a proof that it did the computation correctly. And the key thing here is that you can verify that the prover did the computation like they were supposed to. And you can do it in a way that requires you less work than it would have required you to just do the computation yourself to begin with. So that is actually the key to the power of ZKP. Now, how does this tie into Ethereum? Well, as you probably know, it is extremely expensive to run computations on Ethereum. And so now Ethereum is our resource-constrained computer. It's the computer that doesn't have the time or bandwidth to do the computation that you want done. So with ZKP, we can do computations outside of Ethereum. So you could do the computations, or some stranger could do the computations for you, and they can also make a proof. And then all they have to do in the end, what they're going to do is submit the proof to Ethereum. And now Ethereum only needs the result of the computation and the proof, and it can more efficiently check that the outsourced computation was done correctly. So with ZKP, you can outsource a computation from Ethereum to some untrusted computer. It can do some heavy-duty computation and then submit the result of that computation and the proof of the computation to the Ethereum virtual machine, which can then just do the verification of the proof. And that is much cheaper than having the EVM do all of the work to begin with. So now let's tie it to the graph. So the graph is an application on top of Ethereum and other blockchains. And with the graph, we have many moving parts, and we want all of those parts to be done correctly. One of those parts is payments from consumers that are using the DApp or dApps to indexers who are serving queries from the dApps. So what we want now is a trustless way to track who is owed for queries. And we're currently working on this. We're currently building this ZKP, zero-knowledge proof-based micropayment solution to do this tracking. And I would like to tie this more concretely to the Ethereum virtual machine. Imagine you and I were making many transactions with each other. If we had to track these transactions in a trustless way using only Ethereum, then it would only make sense if we were doing thousands of dollars in transactions for each time. Otherwise, even then, the gas is so expensive. But when we're talking about paying for queries, we're talking thousandths of a cent for these microtransactions. So it doesn't make sense to do this on Ethereum. And that's why we need to do it in a more efficient, trustless way using zero-knowledge proofs.
Episode 44.
From episode 44, Kyle Rojas, Head of Business Development and Partnerships at Edge and Node. Here, Kyle shares how he explains the graph.
That's always a tough one. I think the Google of blockchains helps because Google is a very easily recognized name. But I think I like to use this analogy because it really helped me understand it, and I think it's helped a lot of other people understand it as well. So imagine going into a massive home improvement store like a Home Depot or Lowe's in America or Homebase in Europe or around the world. Now imagine that store is 1,000 times the size
of a normal store. But imagine if every tool, every appliance, every plant, every item were scattered all across the store in no particular order, just piled in. And not only that, millions of items are dropped in from the sky every single day, just airdrop, if you will. The most recent items dropped would likely be the easiest to find, but what about all that junk underneath the billions and probably trillions of other items at the bottom of the pile? And if you think about it in a basic way, that's kind of what happens with data on the blockchain. And if you want a piece of data for an app, just like an item in the store, you have to go scrounging for it, often manually. It's not a fun time, as I'm sure a lot of builders in this space know. And that's where the graph comes in. The graph is indexing and allowing queries for all existing on-chain public data. It's pretty incredible what the protocol does. And then people ask what the different participants do. And I kind of explain it as subgraphs are the individual sections, let's say a screw section. So you build a screw subgraph, and that subgraph goes around that massive 1000x home improvement store and gathers only the screws and organizes it. The curators are the ones who come in and say, oh, it's summer. There's going to be a lot of people buying plants, and they put their GRT to show indexers what's going to be important for whatever season. And the indexers are the individual franchisees that make that one giant home improvement store into 1,000 franchises to make it more palatable. And they go straight to the subgraphs, grab the screws they need based on the curator's signaling, and they put it within their personal store and serve whatever customers come straight to them.
This has been a production of the GRTiQ podcast. For more information, including detailed show notes, visit grtiq.com/podcast. That's grtiq.com/podcast.
Please consider contributing to this project and helping build the community by subscribing and leaving a review. GRTiQ Podcast.